How's it going, everyone? We are talking about Canadian election polls on the day of the election and how the polls do not give us sufficient information to make a reliable prediction. Anything could happen. The polls might look like they're making a clear prediction, but they are not. The data just isn't there, and we will talk about why. So let's get into it. We are looking at 338canada.com. which gives us a lot of different polling results. But we're not going to look at all of them. We are going to look at four which tend to have pretty good reputations. Okay, so we have Nanos, we're going to look at Abacus, we're going to look at Main Street, and we are going to look at Ledger. What we're going to see is that all four of these pollsters show the Liberals a little bit ahead, but so little ahead that the margins of error for their predictions for Liberals and Conservatives are actually overlapping. In one case, one result is directly within the margin of error of the other, so it's either a statistical tie or very close to a statistical tie. We're going to see that the sample sizes are way too small, and there's contradictions between these polls. There's reason to believe that there's sampling error going on, and this is looking at popular vote, and we just don't have the sample size to make predictions about how each electoral district is going to vote. And that's who actually wins the election. It's not popular vote, it's electoral district, and the modeling for the electoral districts is also flawed. So let's get straight into that. First, the results. Okay, so this is the results for Nanos. We see Liberals with 42, Conservatives with 39. Important to read this. The margin of error for this poll is estimated at plus or minus 2.4%, 19 times out of 20 for the entire sample, around the 50% mark. What that means is that, okay, for any result that's predicted, you have to have a margin of error where you're saying, okay, we expect the real result to be within this distance of the predicted result. Okay, so say Liberals 42 plus or minus what? Okay, what range around 42 is where you think the Liberals are going to be? What range around 39 is where you think the Liberals are going to, or the Conservatives are going to be? Okay, 19 times out of 20 means 95%. So they're saying there's a 95% chance that the real result is within 2.4% of the predicted result if the predicted result is around 50%. Okay? For Liberals and Conservatives, yeah, the predicted result is around 50%. Okay, close enough. We see that they are 3% from one another. This margin of error is plus or minus 2.4%, so their margins of error are overlapping. This is very, very close to tied, in other words. Okay, and we see that repeat from the other polls. Okay, Main Street Research, Liberals 44, Conservatives 41, difference is 3%, margin of error 2.2%. Again, those margins of error are overlapping. Okay, the Ledger poll and the Abacus poll, things are even more difficult to predict, because here they say the margin of error for an online sample is not applicable, implying that's what they used, an online sample. It is not a random sample, so they can't predict a margin of error the way they normally would. So for comparison, a random sample of this size, it's not a random sample, but if it was, then that would yield a margin of error of 2.5%. Okay, but again, it's not a random sample, so we don't have a margin of error, and it's kind of considered more correct that if you can't define your margin of error, you just intuitively assume your margin of error is bigger. Okay, so maybe at least 2.5%. And again, the difference between them is 3, which is pretty much 2.5%. Okay, and then for Abacus, same thing. The margin of error for an online sample is not applicable. For comparison purposes, a random sample of this size would give a 2% margin of error. They are 2% from one another. Okay, so for all four of these pollsters, which have a pretty good reputation, the results are with the margins of error overlapping. Okay, it's showing us what's pretty much a tie. Now, it could be argued that, okay, sure, it's pretty much a tie, but liberals are ahead everywhere. Doesn't that count for something? And the answer is kind of, but not as much as you would think because of a suspected sampling error. Now, what is that sampling error? We're going to get into that, and to set up for that, we're going to have to show how these polls actually contradict each other somewhat when we look at the details. So let's go to nanos. When we look at the regional breakdown, we see in Atlantic Canada, Quebec, Liberals are ahead. In Ontario, it's very close, right? Difference of 3%. In the prairies, Conservatives are far ahead. In British Columbia, again, very close, difference of 3%, as we see before with the Liberals a tiny bit ahead, okay? When we look at the breakdown, male versus female voters, we see females are much more liberal, males are much more conservative. No surprise there, right? That result is seen in lots and lots of polls. And then when we look at age, we have the 18 to 34-year-olds, very pro-conservative. We see 35 to 54-year-olds, also pretty pro-conservative. And then we see the 55 plus crowd, much more pro-liberal. Now, what happens when we compare this to the ledger data? Okay, mainstream data does not give us this breakdown. So when we look at ledger, well, for the regional breakdown, things look pretty similar. Okay, Atlantic Canada and Quebec, Liberals are ahead. Ontario, actually, ledger shows Liberals quite ahead rather than pretty much tied with Conservatives. So that's one contradiction. The prairies, we see Conservatives way ahead. British Columbia, we see Liberals and Conservatives very close. Now, look at the gender breakdown. Look how different that is. Okay, so for nanos, let me get to the gender breakdown here. Females clearly liberal, males clearly conservative. But for ledger, we see the liberals a little bit more popular among both male and female voters. That's a very different result. So clearly, I mean, the truth is whatever it actually is. So one of these pollsters, or maybe both of them, are clearly dealing with some sampling bias here, right? With some error caused from sampling people that are not representative of the general population. Okay, let's look at the breakdown by age. For ledger, we have 18 to 34-year-olds are pro-liberal, 35 to 54-year-olds are pro-conservative, and then 55 plus are pro-liberal again. So there's disagreement for the 18 to 34-year-old crowd. Okay, are they pro-conservative or are they pro-liberal, right? And these numbers are pretty far from the margin of error, right? So it's not like they're pretty much tied. No, just one poll is saying that the youth like liberals and the other poll is saying that the youth like conservatives. Only one answer is correct. Okay, so at least one of these is dealing with a sampling bias, all right? The other issue with these ledger results is like, what exactly is the trend here? Like here we see a clear trend for nanos, okay? Younger people like conservatives more. And here, I mean, you don't see a trend like that. It's like the older people like liberals and the younger people like liberals and the people in the middle like conservatives. So that's kind of a unusual result, okay? Now, when we look at abacus, okay, regional breakdown, Atlantic and Quebec tend to be pro-liberal, very close for Ontario, very close for British Columbia, the prairies, Conservatives very far ahead, okay? And here when we look at the gender breakdown, it actually matches the nanos results, right? Where we see females more liberal, males more conservative, but the results are much closer. And then we look at age groups. Well, then again, we see weird things going on, right? We see 18 to 29 liberal, 30 to 44 pretty much tied, right? Conservatives a little bit ahead, but again, margins of error are overlapping here. And then 54 to 59, conservatives are way ahead. And then 60 plus, now liberals are way ahead. Like, so what's going on? There's just no trend here at all. It's the data's all over the place. Okay, so what, again, that tells us is something is off with the sampling with at least some of these polls, maybe all of them. Now, if you go even deeper into the details of some of these polls, you see polls that contradict themselves. For example, when they ask their sample, who do you prefer, liberals or conservatives? They say liberals, but when they ask, do you believe there should be a change in government? Most people say, yes, there should be a change in government. But the liberals are the government right now, so which is it? Like, do you want a change in government and not liberals, or do you want liberals and no change in government? There's a contradiction there. So what's going on with the sampling? Well, we can actually see that when we look at how the results changed over time. Okay, and so say we look at the nanos data, right? Conservatives used to be very, very far ahead, like more than 20 points ahead when we're looking at the beginning of the year. And then this is that last column here, right? And then that conservative lead drops and liberals become ahead, and the liberal lead gets into the double digits, like 10, 11. And then the liberal lead drops and we get to like plus 3% with our overlapping margins of error, right? We see the same thing with abacus, okay? Conservatives ahead, like with lead being in the 20s, almost 30%, right? 27% here. Then it kind of becomes a tie. Then liberals get like plus 6 as their highest lead, and then it drops back down to plus 2, right? With overlapping margins of error. We see the same thing with Main Street, okay? Where conservatives, again, way ahead, right? Double digit lead above 20. Then liberals start to take the lead. Their lead reaches like plus 7-ish, right? And then it starts to overlap again. Conservatives, liberals, conservatives, tie, liberals, again, overlapping margins of error. This almost looks like roulette results, right? Like if you're betting on colors, right? Blue, red, right? You could see results like that. Same with the previous one we looked at, right? Abacus, right? The last kind of few, right? The one we haven't looked at, Ledger, right? Again, conservatives way ahead, right? Plus 20. Then they drop down. It becomes a tie. Liberal lead goes to like up to plus 7, and then it starts to drop down again. So here the last result is actually a difference of 4. Did I say 3 before? Where's Ledger here? Yeah, it's actually a difference of 4, not 3, and this is where your margin of error is not defined, but it would be 2.5. You know, if we can't define a margin of error, we can assume more than 2.5. So we see these contradictions, right? And we see these large swings. Okay, I'm just going to put Main Street up here because they poll every day, right? Where conservatives were way ahead at the start of the year, and then their lead dropped. Liberals became pretty far ahead, right? And then it started kind of going all over the place, and margins of error overlapping much more. So we see a lot of swing here, right? One group way ahead, another group way ahead, then back to tying. And what that tells us is you have a lot of swing voters in these samples, okay? Now, are swing voters making up such a large portion of Canadians that our sample is showing, you know, one party around 20 points ahead, and then it goes to a tie, another party almost 10 points ahead, and then it goes to a tie again? Or is it that these polling groups are actually oversampling swing voters? It looks like they're oversampling swing voters, right? Because these are really massive swings. Do people really change their opinion that drastically, that shortly before an election? I mean, you could argue yes, because you had Trudeau resigning, being replaced by Carney, but at the same time, it's the same Liberal Party, right? So it's reasonable to assume that the actual swings were not so big, okay? So conservatives were ahead before Trudeau resigned, but they weren't that far ahead, okay? And liberals did pop ahead after Carney replaced Trudeau, but they didn't pop that far ahead. Okay, so if they weren't that far ahead in the first place, well then when they dropped down in popularity and things became pretty much tied, it means that this slight Liberal lead that we see in all of these 4 polling results, it could be that, and that the results are so close, it could be actually that maybe the Conservatives are a little bit ahead in reality, maybe the Liberals are a little bit ahead in reality. We just don't know. The results are too close. We have this sampling bias, these signs of contradiction which point to sampling bias, these big swings that tell us we're oversampling swing voters. So maybe among swing voters, the Liberals are a little bit ahead. But what about the voters who are not swing voters? Because they're being undersampled here, we just don't have enough information about them, which means we don't have enough information to know what Canada actually believes. So we have to wait for the election results. Okay? Now, it makes sense that swing voters would be a little bit more pro-liberal, because who are the swing voters? Well, they're people who supported Trudeau, became disillusioned with Trudeau, and then started thinking, oh, should I vote for Conservatives? Oh, it's not Trudeau anymore. Maybe I should vote for Carney. No, I don't know. Now disillusioned with Carney. Maybe I should go back to Conservatives, right? So if these were people who were pro-Trudeau before, say, a couple years ago, yeah, makes sense that your swing voters would be a little bit more pro-liberal, right? Now, why would these polling organizations oversampling swing voters, right? Hopefully they're trying to be accurate and not oversample anybody. Well, why they'd oversample swing voters is because the voters that they thought were not swing voters, the voters who were not swing voters in the past, they have become swing voters now. And again, that makes sense. If these are people who were staunch Liberal supporters, they liked Trudeau, and then they became disillusioned with Trudeau, so now they're swing voters, that makes sense. All right. Now, when did the disillusionment with Trudeau happen? Well, it happened after the last election, which Trudeau won, which was in 2021. Okay. So after 2021, that's when you had a bunch of previously non-swing voters become swing voters. All right. Now, why is that important? Because the winner of the election is not the winner of the popular vote. It's whoever wins the most electoral districts. And Canada has 343 electoral districts. Now, if you were to sample, say, 100 people from each electoral district, that's about 34,000 people that you need to sample to get an accurate set of information from which you can predict who is going to win each electoral district. 34,000 people. What do we see here? What are the samples? 2,000, 2,000-ish, 1.5 thousand, right? This is just Main Street. Let me show all the polls here, right? So we have a lot, 1,000, 2,500, 1,000, 2,000, 2,800. Like the best you'll get here is maybe 3,000-ish. Nowhere near 34,000. Okay, these polls just do not have the data to predict who's going to be the winner of each electoral district, which is what actually decides the winner of the election. So how do they make projections about who's going to win the election? Well, they have models. For example, for each electoral district, here's who won last time. Here's how the popularity nationally, how the popularity of the parties changed. So let's take that national change, apply it to whoever won last time in each electoral district, and see the result. Or you could do it differently. You could look at demographics. Okay, nationally, who do people of different age groups tend to support? What's the age distribution of this particular electoral district? Let's tweak last election's results, or maybe not tweak last election's results, just do it purely by age distribution and see how would this electoral district vote based on nationally how different age groups vote. You can make those kind of models. The problem with those models, there's two problems. One is that they're not taking into account that different electoral districts are different. Even if they have the same age distribution, like in the same province, you could have two electoral districts that vote very, very differently. The other thing they're not taking into consideration is a lot of things changed since 2021. Okay, generally speaking, theoretically, taking the last reliable set of results you have, which is the last election, that's, a very important thing to feed into your model as input. And in 2021, it made a lot of sense because the 2021 election went very similar to the previous election before that. But in Canada, so many things changed since 2021. Okay, Trudeau won in 2021. He was so unpopular that he resigned in this election. Okay, many of the people who are so unhappy with Trudeau, their unhappiness occurred after 2021. Okay, Trudeau is much more disliked in 2025 than he was in 2021. Right? The situation is very, very different than 2021, right? For example, we talked about swing voters, right? A lot more swing voters now than in 2021. Quite likely that that's the case. And so feeding that as an important part of your model might not be very reliable. It might be, but it might not be. Okay, we just don't really know, right? Canada has changed a lot since those years, right? A common debate that you have this election cycle in Canada is you'll have a conservative supporter say that, oh, Carney is just like Trudeau. He's from the same Liberal Party. He was an advisor to Trudeau, right? And then the Liberal supporter will say, well, no, he was only an advisor for Trudeau since around 2021, right? And then conservative supporter will say, okay, but 2021, that's when things started to get really bad, right? And that's around the time Carney started advising Trudeau. And then the two will start debating over, okay, well, why did things start to get much worse after 2021? What exactly is to blame for that? And this debate has been playing out between Liberal and Conservative supporters again and again, very much this whole election cycle, right? So things, what do they agree on? While they're having this debate, what are they agreeing on? Well, that things changed since 2021, right? So again, what do we conclude? That the input data of the 2021 election might not be the best input data, okay? So what we can conclude from all of this is that the polls are just not giving us enough reliable information. So I would not be surprised if any of the four scenarios happened. It could be a conservative minority. It could be a liberal minority. It could be a liberal majority. It could be a conservative majority. Okay, any four of those outputs, that could happen. The polls just, I feel, are not giving us enough information to make a clear prediction. So it looks like it's quite close, and we're just going to have to see what happens. Until next time, enjoy.